thank you for coming. I actually like that it isn't huge, because when we get to Q&A, it'll be a lot more informal, and I hope you ask questions. In fact, the first person to ask a question will get a door prize.
What's your name?
My name's Rob Mann.
No, I said the first person to ask a question.
When we get to Q&A, sorry. Dr. Scoresby put this presentation together a couple years ago. He called me up and we talked, and I was excited about what we were going to do. And we organized with the other mayors in North County this presentation at 5 different high schools. Lone Peak was the last one, and we didn't quite make it because COVID hit. And so I'm actually glad, in retrospect, that we didn't, because I think this is almost more valuable now than before, and we are recording it tonight. So that affects the questions you ask. Okay. Anyway, I'll turn the time over to Dr. Scoresby, BYU professor, man extraordinary. He's a good man, great heart. He's doing this on his own nickel, and we appreciate him very much.
Mayor Mann and I have known each other in a prior life. And one day we were both over at this tire store and just talking and visiting and catching up. And then someone came along and wanted to talk to him. There was a woman and her husband standing there, and so I said hi to them. And they said, well, we've just moved here. And I said, oh, really? Where'd you come from? And I think she said Oregon. But she said, you know, we've lived a while in Lehigh, but Highland has far worse roads than Lehigh does. And I said, well, you know, if I were you, I'd talk to the mayor. And she said, I'd like to, she said. And I said, are you sure? And she said, I would. I'd like to talk to him. And I said, here, I'd like you to meet the mayor. It's one of my very best days.
Average for me.
And so I came to him, and I mentioned to some of you that I was worried about what was happening to our kids, because I have contact with the kids. And so I wrote something that looked like this and took it to him. He read it and he said, here's his words. He was so nice, he said, I love it. And so I said, well, what should we do with it? So he's the one that organized 9 mayors. And I went and visited each one, and they were all really suspicious. And we had to talk to them. I said, no. And they said, well, what are you selling? And I said, I am selling a better way to treat our children in the 21st century. Because 21st century children need something different than the kids in our generation. And we're not adapting fast enough. See, because they're in real trouble, some of them. I was in circles to know that a couple of years ago we had 10 suicides in the Alpine and Highland and so on. And just before we got to Westlake High School, they had their 3rd in that high school. And then the rates of depression and anxiety and so on have increased actually since then, and it's been worse since the pandemic. They've had, cities could tell you that they've had a lot more calls about a lot of conflict in families and difficulty with kids, and this, you know, for a lot of reasons you probably read that. Well, I am the sort of psychologist that it's because I grew up on a farm, and if you grow up on a farm, you just can't sit around and mull over problems for very long, because there's just stuff to do, you know, so you just won't be getting after it. So this represents what we could do in a preventive way, see, and teach the parents in the home to do it so their kids don't get to the position where they're thinking about dying or something else. So anyway, because he has provided service for the Highland citizens for all these years, and I'm acquainted some with how marvelous the mayor's been, I just have a personal thank you I want to give him for this. And you don't have to open it right now, but anyway, thank you very much. Okay, so let me start, and if you have questions, ask them, okay? And the stuff on this handout will be, it'll add some additional information, and it'll give you a little bit background. And then at the end of this, I think there's 10 or 12 action plans that parents can go out and do. And it's really interesting what the research says actually prepares kids to deal with the stuff that is going on. Now, generally speaking, so this isn't about how to specifically solve depression or anxiety or other kinds of emotional disorders. What it is about how to develop in your family children, see, who have courage and confidence and grit, you know, and who take on these situations, see, and they're not blown away by the stuff that happens to them. And I spend a lot of time, I retired from my clinical practice in July of 2019, and I am seeing more clients today than when I retired. Because what I had, what they would call and say, we cannot get in anywhere. This person is 5 months out, and that person is not. So if you have a child, for example, who's thinking about taking their own life, 5 months out is not, it's not acceptable. See, and so that's what I'm doing, and I love young adults a great deal. I stopped saying I love boys, because that is a different meaning nowadays. But I do. And I think there's nothing better than a really good, strong young man or young woman, and all the potential that's available. So this is a little academic, but I think you deserve to know where it comes from. Is that okay? So here's what happened to me. I was a faculty member at BYU, and I moved away from the marriage and I came from the University of Minnesota to help develop the marriage and family therapy program at BYU. And after doing that for a few years, there was an opening in the program on child development or child psychology, and I thought, I'd like to do that, so I did that. And I had the funnest teaching opportunity you could possibly imagine. And these kids would come and we'd talk and visit and so on. But because I was new, the new people, like everywhere else, gets the stuff that other people do not want to do. And they didn't have a graduate course in emotional development, and they said, would you develop one? And I said, okay. So I am now I'm reading stuff, and here's what happened to me. I'm reading and I think, I never knew a single thing about this in my whole wonderful graduate program in Minnesota, which is a wonderful clinical and counseling psychology program. And I'm reading and thinking, oh my gosh, and it has significantly influenced my life. Because as it turns out, our emotions are closely linked to virtually everything we do, but especially to high quality relationships. Emotional intelligence determines whether marriages succeed or fail, or whether friendships, or so on. And here we're not even talking very much about it. So here we go. So here's what this is about. It's how to grow healthy families and emotionally self-reliant children who what? Who face their lives with confidence and grit. And I'm not kidding. These kids nowadays need to be able to do that. Would you agree with that? Okay. Now, do you want to know why? If you were me, you'd be seeing boys who go off with girls and discover they're sexually aggressive. And nobody gave the boys any training on how to deal with a sexually aggressive girl. So they're just sitting there, and the girls understand what to do, and pretty soon they have these boys in all sorts of sexual activities. You'd all blush if I told you some of the texts the girls are writing to boys, and the boys are still doing their stuff, okay? Then you have all sorts of confusing things. There are at least 33 different gender identities available, and kids talk about it openly in school, and they tell each other what they are as sort of a badge of honor. Well, I'm bi. What are you? A trans? she's in the literature. Okay, and irrespective of what that is, the people have a right to choose, their own role in life. But if you're a developing child and you're walking into that, and it's a social It's part of the narrative in society. It's like, well, then who in the heck am I? And what should I be? And I'm good. I'm just telling you a little bit about what's going on. Okay, so we have, here's what they do. Resilient and self-reliant people are like this. This is what they do. So read those quickly and tell me if you want kids like that, or if you like your grandkids to be like that. They are. This is what the research says. They achieve, they start, persistent, finish work, they succeed with people, they have self-control, many friends, happiness, they have a madly successful life, they have empathy, forgiveness, adaptability, and so on. So it seemed to me these would be good things to put into the lives of our children. So emotional self-reliance is an ongoing interaction between the relative power of what people feel inside themselves, like I'm strong, capable, and good, and what they think is the power that's out there in the world around them. So think with me just for a minute. My teacher set my due dates. My parents have expectations, rules. If I belong to a church, then they have commandments they want me to follow. My friends and everybody else, and so on. And pretty soon there's a whole circle of arrows pointing in at me. Now in our area, we do not have, typically the families in our area are not people who do not care much. The families in our area care a great deal, and they want their children to be performing and succeeding and achieving. And so some of that is okay, but I can tell you some kids, they feel so much pressure that they're not sure exactly how to do. I spent time with a boy. His parents were both engineers. They wanted to be an engineer, and he did not want to be. You cannot imagine the conflict in that family. But because all the other kids say we're going to do that. So it's the power we believe comes from events or people and situations that are external to us. So let's take a look at emotion first and go through this and find out what an emotion is. Here's what they do in our lives. They give us focus. Now you should understand that the human brain follows what is called the law of association. And so emotions play a significant role that they link or link up to stuff that happens simultaneously. So here's what happens. This is my wife right here, and we're newly married, and we have a conversation about money, and we don't get it right, and so both of us get angry. The next time we have a conversation about money, what emotion will appear? Anger. And if we don't do something right away, pick up a handout right there on that table. And if we don't do something about that, then anger will become something that they'll say. And then if you knew that the interaction in marriages become highly redundant and repetitive, then they will think the problem in our marriage is money, but it's not money. It's that they do not have a good partnership in order to resolve it. And all that happened one day is, we talked about it then, and then let's suppose that they decide, well, to prevent ourselves from arguing, let's not talk about it. That means we're going to have more arguments about money. Okay? And then people see it goes on and on. So here's what happens. And it gives us focus, because when you have feelings, that you're dealing with, there's a lot of focus on it. This is what happened. Why are you doing this? Well, because I feel this. It motivates us, and it provides meaning. Now, one of the problems with emotion is this that I need to acquaint you with. Because when we started out in life, people change our diapers and feed us. We grow up thinking that someone else causes our feelings. So we say things like, well, I wouldn't have done that if you weren't wearing that nice sweater. Or, I'm pretty lonely because do you hear the language? It's the language of conflict. See, and then if the other person does the same thing, then they would say, oh no, I'm wearing this white sweater because of that shirt. Dork. Then you add this word, pretty soon you know where. And so now we've done enough research to know what the language is of people who are going to get divorced. And that's the beginning of it. And unless they regulate and do something different, see, that's where it comes from. And so it provides meaning for us. We provide meaning. And so on. So So you might be interested in knowing that some emotions are inherited. They're in everybody's brains. They can identify these. So would you mind reading what's on there? Those 6 things, would you read them, please? What emotions are inherited? No,
I don't have my
look up here,
glasses.
right?
Oh, up there.
She doesn't have the
Joy,
glasses.
anger, anticipation, surprise, disgust, and anxiety.
Okay, and they are in a baby's head at birth. Now, babies do not come into the world just sort of blank slates. They have over 100 reflexes, and they're prepared to learn. So who would guess what babies prefer to look at 5 days of age? You show them a variety of things, what do they look at? You show them this or this, this or this, and so on. Face, human face. What's on the human face? Emotions. Thank you for showing a few emotions. And so they can identify these emotions. Then
try pointing it out there.
okay. It's also, you'd be interested to know that emotions are organized into pairs. Now, isn't that interesting? Because if you started developing love for somebody that you're dating, what other emotion would show up soon? Anxiety. Here's what flight for college students, they'll say, oh man, I went out with Jacob last night and he told me he loved me. And I said, wasn't that wonderful? I don't know. I woke up this morning and I was thinking, he slurps when he eats. And I don't know if I could stand that. She's feeling what emotion? Anxiety. And she wants to get away from that. And so where is real, true, lasting love? It's on the far side of anxiety. And what people are the most afraid of when they love somebody is that they won't be loved by them. Isn't that true? So here we go. Fear and anger, joy and sadness, anticipation and surprise. So you could take a teenager, for example, and say, okay, if you have a child who's really excited, a lot of fun, wonderful date, everything's fine, what's the most likely feeling they're going to have the following morning? Some kind of, oh, I don't feel good today, Dad. See, and if you learn just to understand that, you just look at it and say, it'll be okay, sweetheart. Pat him on the cheek and love him and say, everything's going to be fine. Okay, now would you please learn these 3 things? Yes, ma'am.
Number one, where positive, negative emotions are inherited, are you saying that, like, it's just a natural human tendency to have those, or is drawing towards anger something is genetic?
It's in the brain.
What is that?
That means that I can touch that part of the brain and you'd have that emotion.
And some more than others
That-
because of the type of.
Well, that's right. We'll get into that because, as you may know, women's brains are different than men's.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we now know that because they do MRIs, they can identify where the center, these are positive emotions right here, and these are negative emotions right there because they lay in opposition to each other. And then they actually show up, and so on the amygdala, for example, on one end is fear, on the other end is anger. And they can test those, and the person is actually experiencing it. So then we have 3 things called emotional state. Memorize these really quickly, would you please? Emotional state is what? It's the body's response. So if I'm sweating, my heart's palpitating, this is my emotional state. Okay, what's the emotional experience?
How to describe our feelings.
That's right. It's how you describe what's happening to you. I'm not happy. That's my emotional experience. And then what's the other? The emotional display. There's actually more than 3 characters of emotion, but these are 3 enough. Though the display, the emotional display follows cultural rules. See, so we learn to display certain emotions in a cultural fashion. So for example, a Hispanic family from Mexico, not from other Spanish-speaking places, but Mexico, They have all sorts of affection and hugs and kisses, see, because that's how they display, see, feelings. It's also true that in most Spanish speakers who have not been in Spain or Argentina, that the comfortable talking distance between them and other people is 12 inches, and then the United States is 24 inches. So if you're watching somebody in the airport talking from the United States to somebody who's a Hispanic person, the Hispanic person will walk into the person, and the other person will back out. The other person will walk in, and the other person back out, because we learn cultural, what do they call it, display rules. Now think about that for just a minute. So how many different ways are there to display the emotion of love, would you guess? Okay, if you didn't know that one, how many emotions are there then? If you Google them, how many emotions are there? What would you say? Just pick a number.
7.
Nobody will ever know. I would never know this either.
7.
1,800. 1,800 emotions. You can Google them. But most people display love in only 4 to 5 ways. 6 or 7 ways. Think about that for just a minute. If I knew 300 ways to display love, it might be more fun than you. So wouldn't it be a good thing to be able to show that in many different ways and teach them to your kids? See, think about that for a minute. So sometimes when I'm working with a married couple, I'll ask them this question: would you be willing to commit yourself to make loving your spouse your highest priority after God? If you're a religious person, would you be willing to do that? And then they'll say, oh yeah, I would. Do you want to know what the next question is? How do you do that? Right? And there are all sorts of interesting ways that they do not know how to actually carry it out. And think, wouldn't you want to have a lot of love in your life? You know, remember the famous book, The 5 Love Languages, right? So you're supposed to select yours and the other person's. It's nuts. Why would you just want one of the 5 languages? Wouldn't you want all 5? And you say, I plan on having all 5. It's the same to you, because I want to just get in the middle of all of it. I'd like to have everything I can get. So whenever I start working with a married couple, I know 2 things about them. They don't feel enough love for each other, number one, and they have a lousy problem-solving method, or they would not be talking to me, right? So we do not know how to get that. So this is how we express emotions individually and situationally. Okay, now we need to talk about this. How are emotions caused? What causes them? Well, emotions are usually caused by how we interpret our experience, and our thoughts and actions usually do it. It's true that the other person looks like they're causing our emotions, but it's actually our perception of the other person's behavior that's doing it. So if you want to have an interesting experience, here's what you do. 20 times a day, talk about what your feelings are. Like, I'm happy, just simple sentences. And then after you do that for a little while, then say, and I've caused it on myself. Say, I'm happy, and I've caused it on myself. And I'm angry, and I've caused it on myself. And I'm attracted to that guy named Sam, and I was on myself. See? And it turns out to be a little bit different, the meaning of it. Well, if you cause it, then what can you do? You can change it, and you can create it, and you can do all sorts of things. See, it's really interesting. But if a child thinks that they cannot cause their own emotions, and they try, they now think that they're in this situation and they cannot solve that. That's when you start thinking, I just as well die. So, then would you please think this through? We're going to move through this. We ought to spend the whole night on this. So, what do emotions become? If you get the emotional state and the emotional experience and you get the emotional display, what do emotions become? They become what we call personality traits. So they influence the type of character and the type of personality seed that eventually emerges in your family. Now, if you knew that and you knew how to use it as a parent, you could. what can you do? You could actually set up activities and experiences to help your children be more emotionally mature, happier people, more confident. See, and you could help them, see, learn how to be those qualities that I said you need, and confidence and grit. So since some emotions are learned, I'll sit down here with you just for a minute. So, if you could learn these emotions, would you like to learn to be loving and being loved? Would you like to have happiness in your life? Hope? How about hope? You want hope? How about optimism? Optimism, you have to teach the teenagers nowadays. Say, well, to learn to help yourself and to be optimistic, and they'll say, what is that? Confidence, peace, safety, loneliness. They can learn loneliness too, can't they? I promise you, if you got 100 teenagers in the room, 85 of them would say they're lonely. And they will say things like, why don't they spend time with others? And they're talking about the adults in their life. It's a real serious problem. And we're spending time with them. They have all these people that are around. These kids are lonely, often profoundly lonely. So then we have empathy, you can teach that, and compassion, and gratitude, and tolerance, and acceptance. You can do all of that. Now, so let's talk about some things which influence the growth of self-reliance. That's what this is about. So we have the optimal condition, and this is when we have a good match between the parents' brains and the children's brain, and the family environment, and parents are constructing by and large. We have a good emotional condition for them. There's warmth, love, and so on. Minimum amount of bad stuff. Some, but not a whole lot. But here's another problem. Here's what prevents some of it. And they have learned in recent years that brains have different levels of reactivity at birth. And some have highly reactive brains because their screens are that big. And others of us are not as reactive because they have holes in their screens that big. And stuff just doesn't get through. So they're out there having fun, and everything else. And some kids walk out into the world and what happened to that person in Provo that I read about the people? Can't understand that. And we might get bombed, in Israel and so on, and they're thinking about it. See, and those are the kids. If you have high reactivity, those are the kids typically who have more allergies, and they're more likely to miss school because of illness. They're vulnerable to stress, and they will get headaches and sore throats every 2 months or something like that. We all know when I can predict the time when college students get colds and flu. When is that? Final week. Because stress, high levels of stress, do that. The effects of trauma. Some children have traumatic events happen to them, and it is what is called arrest. Slows or stops their emotional development, and they will stay at that age. I once had a patient who had been married for 45 years, and she wanted to celebrate that with her husband, and they worked out a party, and at the party he met another woman and left her. And so when I was talking to this woman, she was 7 years old. That's how she talked and visited, because she believed she was responsible for ending her marriage with her husband of 45 years. It was really, really a terrible thing. Could sexual abuse arrest you only? Oh yeah, because if you're dealing with somebody who's had that experience, you want to know, when did it happen? Because their emotions will start showing up, some of them about that age, about 13 or 14. Premarital sex, for example, under some kids, is a serious trauma condition because they're having an intense physical response without the mental maturity to understand all the meaning for it. God, you cannot believe the negative possibilities of that subsequently to their marriage. What happens for years and years after that. And if you had the experience that I did, or that I do, or that, boy, you'd be dancing around on one leg and left leg and saying, because you didn't want all your boys and all your girls, just to say, stay, we're going to lock you up. We do what Mark Twain said to do with rearing children. He said, when your children are born, put them in one of these wooden staved barrels and feed them through the bunghole. And then when they turn 13, close the bunghole. This is actually social contagion. What's social contagion? Would anybody care to define that? Well, you know what they're doing over in Lehigh, right? And you know the families down the street with their, all of my friends, Dad, can run nude through the parking lot at school. And so, and I would say all of your friends are idiots. And so, you moved really fast on that last page. Can you go back to it? I can't remember. There it is. Here's this one, the absence of a nurturing environment. Now, let me tell you some really interesting things. So researchers have studied everything. They've studied consoling and comforting parents to children. And they've done longitudinal studies, and they have discovered that when parents do not comfort or console their children, then when they're young adults and older, the children do not believe there's any way to stop negative emotions. And so comforting turns out to be a way that the brain learns this doesn't have to last. Now, see how many parents are really busy. How many are busy doing all sorts of other things. And that's not going on. I'll give you an example. I have a patient who was molested by her older brother when she was 9, 10, or 11. And when her parents found out about it, this was long ago, this woman was now 50 years old, still having difficulty. Her dad said to her, what do you think her dad said? What did you do that made this possible? Because 40 years ago, that was the thought, wasn't it? That if girls got caught in that, they must have done something, to make it available. And so he wanted to know what she did. Of course, it's his son, so he was doing it as well, so the dad's caught. Okay. Now think about that for a minute. So this woman didn't have any way to end all of the stuff that was going on about that because her father did not gather her in his arms and just hug her really tight and say, sweetheart, I am so sorry this happened to you. We will take care of this, and I'm here, and I'll be there every day. He just said, what did you do? And we might have done the same thing. No parents in those years ever had any kind of experience on how to handle sexually abused or sexually molested children. So that was a common response. So it's a little bit about what happens. Okay, now, so the next one. Okay, so what does it look like? Well, when you're self-reliant, emotionally, you know how to live successfully, you experience more positive and negative emotions. Name 3 positive emotions. They are joy, love, happiness. What are 3 negative? Anger, anxiety, and jealousy. And it could be any, right? Self-reliant people know more positive than negative. So what's been happening in their families? They have been around love and happiness and cheerfulness and kindness and so on. And if they have a negative emotion, the parents will say, come and talk to me about that. Comfort and console them so the negative changes to a positive. See? They develop a sense of self-control over emotions and thoughts. I can manage this. They can generate positive feelings and regulate negative ones during times of distress. Okay? Social confidence and adaptability. That's what they're like. So if you want that kind of child, then let's learn how to do that. Okay? More being resilient, hopeful, persistent in completing work, displaying forgiveness, tolerance, integrity, and so on. Having many friends and acquaintances, and successful intimate relationships. People who are not emotionally self-reliant have real trouble in intimate relationships. Now, I'm going to tell you some data that ought to be really interesting to you. 30 years ago, the Pew Research Institute reported that 42% of the boys in America are growing up without access to their fathers. Now, you could read that and think, whoa. Because of divorce, because of unwanted pregnancies. But what do fathers do? It's really interesting. Fathers are more influential than mothers in helping children establish a gender identity and empathy. So a boy who grows up without access to a father can, unless something is done, actually grow up without knowing that stuff. Then they'll date some girl, find her attractive, and she will not know any different, and she'll marry him, and then she'll get inside the marriage relationship and discover that she is with somebody who's emotionally barren, and he's never going to understand her feelings, or never appreciate who she is or what she's like, and her choices are to live like that, or to leave. And I promise you that's going around like crazy. And some girls are like that because it turns out that 42% of the boys are not having their dads, so are the girls. And so what do girls, what do fathers do for girls? They can teach them about warmth. They can teach them the difference between sexual attraction and just warmth and love from their dads. And so here this stuff has been going on all these years. See, we have all these things going on in the lives of these kids. What that means is you might be rearing your children, getting them all ready to be successful in their marriages, but there's a whole bunch of other people that they're going to date and they are not being prepared. And then we don't know that that's happening until they get in it and actually have the experience, and boy, you can watch it. Okay, so what prevents it from going on? We'll go through this quickly. High anxiety. Anxiety, is that an inherited emotion? Yes or no? So you can have high levels of that, and the higher the level, the less self-reliant you're going to be. Intense brain activity and other inherited mental and emotional disorders. The overriding perception of feelings are caused by others. Lack of positive individuality, sometimes caused by prolonged illness. Children who have long illnesses during childhood, bed care and all this stuff, they have a hard time with self-reliance. Insufficient comfort from others, abuse and episodes of mistreatment, or disruptive parenting. Are you sincere about helping your children? Have you given up anger?
No.
That's one of the things you can do right away. Because a parent's anger will, what emotion will it cause in the kids? Anxiety. And so if you're sincere about that, you go right to work, you put an X on the calendar, the last time you got mad. I've done that. And then the next time you got mad, you put another X and say, okay, there's 3 days between the X's. So then I'm going to make sure it's 4 days, and then 5 days and 6 days. I did that until there was 2.5 months between my X's, and I thought, okay, I'm good. And besides that, you'll become more influential if you don't get mad. Because, see, some kids whose parents get angry at them, the contest is over. If I can make you mad, I don't have to deal with the consequences of my bad behavior. See, that's what they're doing. And they'll play you. Sometimes they'll do that.
So how do you get rid of your anger?
Well, the best way is just to go at it. Just say, stop it. And I'm going to keep track of it. And then every time you do, say, what works. And then you can get some stopping mechanisms, like you want to count to 10, you want to learn to be more positive, you want to, because if you're angry, if you get angry, you're also a dependent person and your life is being controlled by others. Remember, I said to you that is the fundamental flaw in all this, that you believe your emotions are caused by others. And parents think that, and we all tend to think that. Our politicians think that. No, our politicians don't think. I'm sorry, Mayor. Neglect, abandonment, rejection, we have a bunch of that, and excessive electronics and technology use, because what that does is retard and stunt the brain's growth. Or we have real good evidence now that if you let your kids involved with that a lot, the brain usually goes from the parietal areas right here to the frontal lobes, and there are people who use excessively electronics. This movement from here to here is retarded. This up here is called the association area, which is linked. All your emotions and everything links to decision making. So if I'm about to make really bad decisions, if I decide with this part of the brain as paired with this one. So you'll say to your kids, "Now, why do you think I'm so good right now?" "Well, because, we're all," he said, "come on over, we'll just cut off our little fingers." And I thought it would be okay. It's about that done. I'm not kidding. Okay, here we go. What are the signs that it's not adequately developing? Read those. Dependence and entanglements that prevent the growth of autonomy, false beliefs. Yeah, many of you have false beliefs about people and things. Yeah. I wouldn't have been this way if my dad had lived somewhere else instead of the farm. Because, I'd have been more mature and more sophisticated, because we lived in a rural area that was so rural. You had to drive at least 50 miles to commit a sin of any kind. It's a true story. And anybody who grew up in a place like that knows exactly. You could swear at the tractor, but that was it. There wasn't anything else. Dependencies and entanglements that prevent the growth of autonomy. What is a dependence? You make me this, you make me that. I need you. You've got to. What's a false belief system? A false belief system is that I believe things about myself that are not true. People think, that I am just an old man. Well, it's true I'm old, but I'm not just an old man, right? See, and you acquire false beliefs about yourself and about other people. And I'll bet you the mayor could tell you this city is rampant with conspiracy theorists. Usually we'll call and say, "No, I think we have one in our neighborhood." Came over one day and said, "I saw this boy early this morning with curly hair walking out behind our yards checking on things," and we looked at him. He said, "Thank you very much. It was my wife. She was out for an early morning walk." Never did tell me. Okay. Rapid self-criticism. Oh, gee, isn't this a beauty? Once you start self-criticizing, you can build a library of that in your brain, and it could just go on and on. It just goes from one thing to another. And then the inability to establish and maintain emotionally intimate relationships. If you had time with that. Some of our kids have a problem with that. Okay, next please. Here's what happens: low energy, devitalized relationships, social anxiety, dishonesty and deception, addictions, eating disorders, and self-harm. Cutting, for example, we have cutters around us. We have other kinds of harm, intense feelings of being controlled or excessively trying to control others. And these are the symptoms of what happens when it's not developing. So you look around at your kids and say, if my kids have got any of these things, see, they are not developing emotional self-reliance. Okay, let's go to the next page. So what can you do? Well, you can learn more about emotional intelligence. You can be what is called a healthy emotional coach. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. You can teach your family story. Did you know, for example, that telling your family story to your children helps them be more self-reliant? I find that interesting. There's significant research that shows if you tell them a story about the ups and downs of your ancestors, well, they had a hard time here, then they did that, and then here's what they were like, and so on. When your children or your grandchildren know the family story, it helps them be stable and consistent when times are a challenge for them. Okay, here we go here. The examples often teach about positive emotions. I'd have a challenge for you. Besides giving up anger, then I'd like you to commit to for this whole next week to accelerate your expressions of love and of gratitude in your family. And see what happens when you introduce love and gratitude in greater abundance in your home. Teach and promote emotional standards of family membership. In our family, we're quite happy at meal times, okay? And if you can't be happy, well, then why don't you go back to your room and think about it for a minute and then come back, because we're happy, we're happy. You know what that is? And if you need help becoming happy, I'll help you be happy. You know, everything will be fine. Okay, now we're at 6. 6. Read 6. Read 6.
Express anger sparingly and mildly.
Create shared projects and mentor. Eat family meals together and talk and express healthy love. Families that eat together at least 3 times a week, their children do better academically and better emotionally and better socially. You aware of that? Rutgers University study, big massive numbers of people. Okay, so how many meals? Well, you're probably grandparents by now.
We eat together.
You eat together every night. You eat together every night.
It's kind of fun.
So he's emotionally self-reliant now, you think?
Getting there. Getting working on it.
Okay. Okay, let's talk about what we can do then. What can you do? I'll just give up on this. Sure. Okay, so these are some actual things you can do to promote it in your family. These are written in your handbooks or a little handout. Know how emotional self-reliance develops. I've covered that. Organize a family plan to promote emotional self-reliance rather than wait till problems appear. How many of you have a plan to promote emotional self-reliance in your family? Well, none of you? Okay, if you're grandparents, how many of your children have a plan to promote emotional self-reliance with their kids? Well, what are they doing then in their family? Just trying to get by every day? You know, busy at work and so on? Think about what that means. That means we're all grown up, sort of, and we want to have love and everything else. But if we're not doing this really well, then we're not going to. We want them to be emotionally self-reliant. Because if you're LDS, they go on missions and stay. If you're not LDS, they go to college and thrive. Or they get married and they're successful in their relationships. See, and so on. We just have to face the fact that what our children are telling us is that we're late, way late. See, for a lot of these kids. So you differentiate your children as unique individuals. Stop saying all the girls this and all the boys that, and the little boys and then the big boys and all that stuff. Stop doing that. Say this is Harold and John and Ralph, and he's like this and he's like that, so that they know you know them as an individual, okay? Understand family and child development? We all had some things. That's the reason why we had the oldest child, is so we can learn about child development from that child. And then after we get through with the oldest one, we're going to ship that one back in. We learned a lot, you know, from that child. Isn't that right? Okay, yeah. So, but see, if we knew a little bit, you can read about child development. It's all over, everywhere. You can read how emotions develop over time, how language develops over time. You get those fascinating things like, did you know that the human brain commits to its native tongue in about 3 months? And from then on, it starts building brain connections with all the sounds that it hears most of the time. And did you know all these wonderful things about children see and how they see the world and think about life and so on. I need to go hug this woman right here. Excuse me. Let's need that. Okay, and then create a climate of safety, right? What does that mean? You can come here, you can talk, everything will be okay. I'll love you, I'll keep loving you, even though you make mistakes, you create safety. And apply positive discipline. Now, I want to take a minute and tell you what that is. Positive discipline means that when a child makes a mistake, you will focus more on their learning the correct behavior than you do on punishing the bad. So, if you're applying positive discipline, it looks like this. A 10-year-old and a 12-year-old in my family were playing a game and got into a fight. And they hit each other, which is not acceptable in my family. So I went in and stopped it and then took the two of them and set them down. I said, well, the two of you demonstrated that you don't know how to do something, so you're going to have to learn. By this time, I'm an experienced father, and so the 10-year-old boy said, well, what do we have to do? And I said, well, here's what you're going to have to do. I'm going to choose a game that is very difficult to play, and I want you to play it happily all the way through. So I know you can do that without getting into a fight. And he said, well, what if we won't do it? And I said, well, how long can you live without eating? And he saw the wisdom in my position. So I found a game that was called Sonic. You played Sonic? It's a tough game to play. So I gave it to them, and they're in there playing, and I walked by just in time to hear the 12-year-old say, oh, you took my man, how nice. Now, what couldn't they do? They could not talk over stuff, which adults need to learn to do, right? So I got him after the game, put him on the couch in front of me, and said, now, I'd like to see you have a 15-minute conversation so I know you know how to talk to each other. Because you cannot go through life making a mistake and hitting people. It just is not a good way to live. Now, if you knew who those two were, and you knew my family, you would know that every time we get together, those two find each other. And they'll go off walking together, and they have become really close friends. Maybe they would have anyway, but being punished together makes children stay together. Now, what's positive discipline? You are way more concerned about what you want them to learn. See, and sometimes the solution is just to satisfy the emotional need. You will think I'm nuts. But listen, we have a child, and he's a little bit irritated and unhappy, and I say to him, well, you're not getting along with your kids, so you're going to have to go get some ice cream with me. Really, Dad? Yeah, really. You're going to go get some ice cream, you're going to eat at the top. When we get through, his emotions will change. He feels cared for. And you can tell if you have little kids, the child you're having trouble with that day is the child who has least access to communication in your family. So what would the solution be? Get to him and communicate. And talk and visit. So he begins to feel better. See, we have all this, stop that, get off, shut up, be quiet, and so on. Some guy in Great Britain, I'll always remember the study because I love to say his name. His name is Bothell Bernstein. If you're on your alone when you're trying to say Bothell Bernstein, it's like, it's fun to say, isn't it? So here's what he did. He was a cultural and language anthropologist. He went to the primary schools in Great Britain, some of them said, I want to know the top 25% of your students' names and the bottom 25% and their parents. And he went to their homes. He asked every family the same question. What do you tell your children about school? And then he recorded what they said, and here's what he did. He just counted the number of words. And he identified that there is an expanded communication code in some families and a restricted communication code in others. Who are the high-achieving kids? Which group do they come from? The expanded one. Now think about it for a minute. So if the parents are saying to the kids, shut up, get off, that's 2-word sentences. And they're training an attention span, so by the time they get there to kindergarten, just for the heck of it, I went to kindergarten one time with a stopwatch and measured the average length of time of a kindergarten teacher. just to prove my point. It's well over 2 minutes. Hi, children. We're going to talk about green today. And they talk about green. After the first 3 words, she has gone way past some of those kids who grew up in a family where, okay, now who's going to be disruptive in kindergarten? And who's the teacher going to say, Ellen, stop that? See, and a cycle begins. And they'll stay in it. They'll stay in it until they're about sophomores in high school or freshmen, and then what will they do? I don't know what they'll do, because I've been with the Alpine School District, and I know they drop out. And then they have families, and then when their children grow up, what do? They drop out. And I promise you, it's 3 or 4 generations in this area about what's going on. Okay, you have to adapt your discipline approach to children, gradually creating all over. Here's one. Independent decision making does not mean you make your own decisions all the time. How come it is so difficult for us with our children to say, I've made decisions for you. I think it's time we make them together now. So when you're going to make these decisions, let's talk it over. You tell me what your opinion is, and if I like it, it'll be a go, and if I don't, let's keep talking, right? And then you get them a little older, and then you say, no, I think that's yours. You make that one. And then you teach them what a good decision is gradually over time until they become really good decision makers. Because you can just plan on this happening. My dad and I spent a lot of time together growing up. One year he purchased a new Oldsmobile. Now you probably do not remember Oldsmobiles. You remember Oldsmobiles? Oldsmobiles are huge, powerful cars, okay? And if you ever had a chance to drive one, you'd get in that, and so I could hardly wait. So I said, Dad, you can go, you can drive in Idaho at age 14, you get a license at 14. So I'm out, and I've been driving combines that are tens of thousands of dollars and such. So driving the cars, nothing if you're a farm boy. So I get in the car, and I'm ready to leave, and he walked by me. That's all I did. And he said these words: I drive cars about as fast as I think I can handle them. A mysterious statement, right? So I'm down short. Okay, back out. Slow until you're out of sight, and then what? I promise you that a new Oldsmobile will pin you right to the front seat, and you're just going, yes! And it's a good thing. So we went to the movie, finished the movie, came home, took the long way, got to this intersection where there were no lights, and we met, I'm telling you the truth, another new Oldsmobile. Now, if you're a boy and you have a friend, you have another boy and friend, what would you do? You're going to have to race. So we raced. So down. It was a straight line road for about 1.1 miles, and then there was a railroad track that had a good rise, and across the railroad track you had to bend the road to get across a bridge of an irrigation canal. It was our home territory, so we're going. I promise you get to be 100 miles an hour in just a few seconds in one of those cars. And we're going down this road right there, and I hear in my mind, I drive cars about as fast as I think I can handle them. And I pulled up. And my friend said, we were winning. I said, no, I need to slow down. So he slowed down too, and he went ahead of us. I have vivid memories of him crossing that railroad track, and he cleared the ground. And he went across it, and it's fishtailed on the other side, and slowed down and made it. And I turned to my friend and said, if we didn't stop, we would have killed him. Because he had never made it. If he'd gotten over the road, he never made the turn in the road. I go back and think about that, and I think, why did I decide just to do that? Mostly it was because I had used respect for my dad. But it was also true that I had been making decisions with his help for a long time. And the pressure from my friend didn't matter. I was going to do what I believed to be right. And so I pulled up. Gradually create independent decision making. And then 9, understand personal fables and imaginary audiences. Have you ever heard those words before? Well, let me tell you what they are. almost all teenagers create what is called an imaginary audience that they perform for when they go to school. It's somebody that they are trying to impress. It could be the girls. If you're a boy, it could be the boys if you're a girl. And it could be somebody else who you think is really important. It really matters a lot who your imaginary audience is. So if you had a teenage child, would you ask them about who you're trying to impress? Because they're trying to become like that. It's really interesting. So if college freshmen have an interview with their professors in the first semester, one-on-one, they get higher grades in college than the college freshmen who don't go meet their professors. Why? Who's the imaginary audience of the students who go visit their professors? Their professors. Who's the imaginary audience of the students who don't go? That's right, the other kids. And then let me tell you about a personal fable. Everybody creates a personal fable. It's a made-up story of who I am and what I'm like. And that's it. My personal fable may be I'm ugly and down. I've seen so many kids in my professional life that walk down and act down and so on. And they sit down and I'll say, so how done do you think you are? I'm pretty done. I said, well, is it temporary or is it permanent? And they'll say, well, I don't know. And I said, well, let's talk for a little while. And then I'll say, I've given a lot of intelligence tests. And I said, I'll give you one if you want. And then when I give them an intelligence test, I said, well, I'm sorry. And I said, why? And I said, you've blown your cover. Your average IQ on this test is 100, and you're at 127. You are way far from done. Well, I always thought I was. Well, why did they think they were done? Because they were measuring their intelligence by grades at school, okay? Or they will have a personal fable of being a social outcast with no friends. Or they'll have a personal fable of being arrogant or smart or whatever. They're all personal fables. Would you pay attention to your teenage kids and grandkids and find out who their, imaginary audience is and their personal fable? You just talk with them. You say, what are you thinking about? Where'd you like to go and stuff? Teach moral behavior and moral leadership. Okay, I'll just quickly cover this because there's more in the handout. What's moral? It's really easy to define. It used to be really hard. Moral is what helps people, and immoral is what harms them, including themselves. Now think about it. It isn't even right versus wrong. Sometimes it is, but it's not always that wrong and right. Because sometimes moral is doing what's wrong. We reserve our highest honor in our military services, by the way, for people who disobey a command in order to save somebody. And besides that, I'd like to point out to you, having spent a large number of hours talking to kids who make terrible mistakes, most of the people who make mistakes know what right and wrong is. And they still do it wrong. That's why you would teach moral behavior is what helps them and other people, what harms them, what helps their growth. And you would say, well, do you have children? Do they all do their chores or do you want them to? But if they did do their chores, would it help your family? And if they don't do their chores, does it interfere with the quality of family life? So you could sit down and say, okay, now what we're trying to do is to get everybody to help out here, right? So if you do, and you do, and you do, then we all do, then, okay, and you can teach helping and harming. And you just teach that, and you teach your kids to help. And then find out what they come up with. One of my kids years ago at breakfast, I'd ask questions because I was writing a book on moral development, and I said, did any of you do anything to help others yesterday? Silence. The next morning I asked the same question, silence. And the next day I asked it, and the boy in the fourth grade said, I did. And I said, tell me about it. And he said, well, during recess today, there were some bigger boys who were bullying a younger boy. And I told him to stop him. This boy happens to be a big kid himself. So I assumed they did. And I said, then what? And he said, I went and played with this boy. Is he learning moral behavior? See, and you could introduce that. You could teach healthy belonging, inclusion, and other social skills, and you could create a tradition of doing hard things, and combined with emotional support. Well, it is really hard what we're going to have to do. I can tell you that right away. We're going to have to cut down a lot of trees, make roads. You know, it's going to be really tough, but I think we can do it. What do you think? Okay, and it'll be hard probably, but if we're pressed, we could probably come up with ways to do it. Maybe we'll laugh and have a good time. But we all want to learn to do hard things. Why? Because most of the time, or a lot of the time, life is hard. And we either face it or we will. And if we face it, then we have to learn how to do it and adjust to it. True or not true? Okay, is that the last one? I didn't do too bad. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask before we end? I just gave you a fire hose version of this.
You mentioned a little bit ago about telling our family story. What did you say that helps the children? How does that help them?
Well, they're doing studies about emotional self-reliance. Remember the first slide that said, here's what kids are like who are self-reliant. They're confident and so on. They have found that a very high percent of the time, the more reliant kids are, the more likely they are to know their own family story. They know where they came from and so on, and then they compared those with kids who don't know their family story, and a greater percentage of them are vulnerable to the kinds of emotional problems I just described. Because they don't have a network and they don't have a history, see, of their own family. My grandfather was born in England. He immigrated to Australia. He and his brother homesteaded some land. They met the Latter-day Saint missionaries. And then they joined that church. And then they immigrated to the United States, poor as church mice. And then they worked and saved and so on. And my family story is my dad saying, we got a 50-cent piece for Christmas one year. And I got a harmonica, and that was memorable. They worked and saved, okay, until they could buy some land. And they were cheated by the locals that they moved to, and they surpassed that, which foreigners often were in those days because they just didn't know, and they were too trusting. Okay, and then we have a legacy. See, in my family, if you knew our family, you would know that our family works very hard. So I can get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and write for 3 hours, shower, get ready, and have breakfast, and go to work one day, and then work late in the evening. And that does not bother me, because I've been doing that since I was very young.
Thank you.
And you tell us, or yes?
So, you mentioned, that a lot of kids over the past little while had committed suicide in this areas. And a lot of the audience here is what I would expect not to have young children except for her. If you've got teenagers and young single adults, where can you start to help them become better, more self-reliant? Maybe they're victims of poor parenting when they were younger. So where can we start with our older children?
It's a wonderful question. Thank you. You could just sit down with them and say, I've learned a few things, and I'd like you to read it. Or, I would like to talk to you about what we do for the next year or 2 or 3, because I think there's more I can do as a mother. And I'd like to, frankly. You could ask them. But there's a lot of things you could institute in your relationship with them without ever talking to them. You could, for example, you mind if I ask you? Are they living at home?
No, my 2 youngest aren't, but my 4, there's one's married, 2 of them are in college.
Okay, so you can call the ones who are living away every so often and say once a week, and say something like, I just called because there's 1,000 reasons why I love you, and I just want to tell you 2 today. And so you tell them you love them and how proud you are, and then you talk with them a little while. then they tell you stuff and you say, well, you know, as long as I know you, sweetheart, you are. You know, and you tell them what you know her to be. You say, I'm really proud of you. Go on. You could do that. Okay, you could also, then, if you have a conversation relationship with them, you could comfort them. Couldn't you? Okay, suppose one of your daughters loses a baby stillborn in the hospital, where would you be? With her. And what you'd be doing is having her in your arms and comforting her and saying, I love you, and then you'd be saying, come on. There's another day, and I believe in it. And you teach them optimism. See, and you keep them going. And then when somebody says, I don't know if I can do this, Mom, you can say, well, let's talk about it. Maybe you can. So tell me how tough it is. Oh, yeah, that is tough. But I've known you as somebody who's quite willing to face a challenge like that. So what do you think? So you can have a conversation about confidence and so on. It's in your language. If you read through this and you got the ideas in mind, just put it in your language and talk about it.
I have heard the term used, snowflakes. Now, that is a term that seems to be used to describe children that are very dependent, that are very weak, that are very fragile. And my question is, there's also another term called helicopter parents. So I'm wondering if helicopter parents contribute or contributed to this snowflake mentality that the millennials and the Gen Xer generation apparently seem to have.
Well, I don't think you'd make a law that was the case, but you would expect that it would be true some of the time. And you would also expect that it would be different for different people, because helicopter parents have their own stuff that they're helicoptering about. And so you'd have to do that. But that's what disruptive parenting would be like. You'd get parents who are too controlling, too afraid, and then you get some parents who are too far away. And it's one of the toughest things in life is to know what the balance is for any individual child. So what you try to do is to involve them and then individualize them and so on. And you just keep working at it. But I'm quite confident that there's a link between some forms of behavior that you're talking about and what kids do. And what's interesting is that the parents often cannot see it. See, if we're talking just about the parents, see, I think we have amazingly good parents, a large number of them. But boy, if you were me and you talk with some kids, and then when they find out, the parents find out about what they're doing, the parents will say, I didn't have a clue. And that just frightens me. Because, I mean, their kids are dealing with very high-risk behavior, and the parents don't have a clue. Because they have a perception of their kids, and they are not willing to keep learning about their children. And you don't have to overdo this, but you can say, I want to spend time with you every week, and I want you to tell me what's going on. I'll drive you to school, and I'll do whatever, but I want to meet. Well, I'm busy, Dad, and I said, good, but you're not so busy you cannot talk with me. I happen to be the wisest, best person you know, or you're concerned. And besides that, I own the car. So let's, so see, you work out something where you keep doing that. But no, there's a lot. If we went down a list of disruptive parents, that would be one of many. Parenting is tough. It's tough duty nowadays. And if you're a single parent, oh my gosh. You know, if we knew what a lot of single parents go if they have to work outside the home, you know, we'd be rushing over there and hugging that person a lot and finding ways to street. It is really hard. Parenting is hard, isn't it? Kids act like kids. They're emotionally immature, right? But see, they're ours. And so we need to help them. So anyway, how this started was this, and then you have an appreciation for mayor men looking at this and saying, let's do this. And he's why we're doing this. And so he said, what if no one comes? And I said, then I'll give it to you, and you probably can benefit. And, but if one comes, then it's one family, right? And that's enough. See, and we just have to keep at it everywhere. We ought to be doing it inside our churches. We ought to be doing it in the schools. And all you'd have to do to believe what I'm telling you is just go get into conversation with some kids and ask them the right questions. But there are also many healthy, wonderful, thriving kids who do really great. Go talk to the vice principal of an elementary school. Anybody a vice principal of elementary school? Ask them what they deal with every day. Because they're a sixth grade girl, going on 1 month, I'll tell you. Some bullying, of course. But they're out there following each other. They're in recess, and they'll be dealing with that. I don't want to scare you. There's a lot of happy, healthy people. I'm just telling you that's what they do. And the majority of kids are doing pretty well, actually. But we have a growing, creeping percent of the kids who are not. And they are the ones that should scare us a lot, for their sakes. You know, just because of the kind of life they are leading. My heart has been broken so many times by what happens to kids that I've stopped crying about it. Because I love them, and they are filled with all sorts of great things. We just need to do better by them, in my opinion.
So, if there are those kids out there, how do we help our kids in interacting with them and avoiding some of the things that might happen?
Well, you would say, this might happen. So if you're my daughter, I would say, who gets to touch your body? Would you name them, please? You're my daughter and you're age 11. Who gets to touch your body? You do, right? Who else? Your mother? Your dad? And maybe a doctor, is that right? And that's about it. So if somebody wants to touch your body, let's talk about what you could say. So here's what you could say. I know about all that stuff, and I'm not interested. Get away from me. So you can do that. And you can practice that. And then after you do that, see, then we worry that what we're doing is teaching our children to be afraid of other people. It's a terrible dilemma that we're in. But I'd rather have my children afraid of some people than actually have the experience. Wouldn't you? And so I am very optimistic and positive, and that's why this program is laid out in. Read the last part of it, and it's all the things we can start doing right away. So I'm hopeful you look at that and get together if you're married and say, let's pick 1 or 2 of these and start and see what we can do. Get in the middle of it and try it out. I think if you do, you'll find out it'll help your parenting, it'll give you more tools, and it'll give you ways relating to emotions. Will give you a good way to interact with kids. Yes, ma'am.
How do you motivate children who seem unmotivated towards success, things that would bring success in their lives, either education or other experiences?
How
They
old?
just seem like they enjoy the status quo.
How old? A person?
High school.
High school age? Well, with a child like that boy, I guess,
Yes.
I think you have to have people around who will just talk and get into talking. That would be the first step. And then you say, I just want to talk with you. And you just ask questions, not about that. You just find out about him. You think about what's going on. And then when you have good rapport, you can address the question just a little bit. And you'd realize that a person that age, the choice that he makes is really important. So you'd say, how long do you want to stay like this? You don't seem to be interested in a bunch of stuff, and I get that. Maybe it's all worthless to you. But I'm concerned about you. And I would like to know if you want to take charge of your life or continue like this and tell me what you have in mind. And if he said, I like this, I would say, well, okay, I'll be back. Now, if you're a parent, then you cannot escape it, right? So I want to talk to you again today, son. Or not spoil anything, really. So you talk about something else, and that's where you, and if he won't talk to you, tell him stories. Tell him about your life experiences. Just keep the stuff going from your brain to his brain. Then one day you might want to tell a story about some ancestor who, immigrated from Australia to America and bought himself a farm, say, or something like that. Or something like that. And then while you're doing that, see if you can refer to the feelings you think he's feeling. Maybe he lacks motivation because he's afraid. Maybe he lacks it because he's been offended or hurt somewhere. And maybe he's looked out into the world and he thinks, to hell with it. I just said that, at emphasis. Sure. I personally do not do that. I just would like, for the purposes of this conversation. And then you start, and then give yourself time. Give yourself 3 to 5 months. So, and then you start saying things like, you do this better than most. I mean, I've noticed that being unmotivated is a skill you've developed. And as soon as you say that, you're talking about him being a success. And maybe it's fear, so you just keep going. Really, it's the conversation. So have fun with it. Just talk and visit with him and say, well, you can even say, I don't want this, but maybe you found the real purpose of life. So I'll tell you what, I'll take my clothes off too, and we'll just sit home and suntan. Don't ever do that.
Along the same lines, in that conversation, how would you advise, like, responding to them when they get super defensive and put their heels up and kind of
if you're preaching to them, then you have to stop that. But let's suppose that you're just talking about stuff, because he will think that's what you're talking about. So you say, hold it just for a minute. You have a perfect right to your opinion, and I will listen to it. I want to hear it. Guess what? I have a perfect right to mine, and so I'm going to tell you about my view. But if you're a parent, the tendency is to say, you should, you ought to, and so on, and you have to avoid that a while, because they're all set to parry that, so they'll defend themselves against that. What we want is for your ideas to get in his brain, and to begin with, we don't even care what they are. We just want him to be receptive to what's going on. If you sat down and said, let me tell you about something that happened to work today, and you told about an experience, that would be good enough to begin with. See, because when you're unmotivated, you're shutting everything away from you, right? See, and so that's where you start.
Thank you.
Great questions. Nice of you to come. Thank you again, Mayor Mann. It's so nice of me to meet you. I am going to do this again at the, what's the name of that school?
American Heritage.
American Heritage School on January the 7th. They just called today and said, would you come? Yeah. I said, did you do anything good there? She said, well, I think so. I said, okay, then I'll come. Thank you. Pleasure, Hart. Thank you.